Welcome, everyone, to the second event on the series of the UN75 anniversary. My name is Cristian Lara, and I'm Rethinking Diplomacy Fellow. On the occasion of the 75th anniversary of the United Nations last year, the UN Secretary General decided to open a global consultation, and among many activities was a survey responded by 1.5 million people in 193 countries. Within the framework of the Rethinking Diplomacy program, the UN75 series is dedicated to exploring the most relevant issues highlighted by the UN75 Global Consultation Report. On the introductory event on January 28, the UN team responsible for the initiative presented the rationale and the meticulous process behind such an unprecedented project. On this second event, we will focus on what the majority of the respondents identified as the most important long-term challenge humanity is facing, the crisis and the environment. So we are delighted to have the Executive Director of the United Nations Environment Program, Assistant Secretary General Mrs. Joyce Msuya, joining us from Nairobi, where the UNEP Executive Office is located. And I will open the floor to Dr. Elizabeth Losos, so she can introduce her properly, and Dr. William Pan, who will moderate this conversation. But first, I would like to extend thanks to the Trend Foundation for supporting the Rethinking Diplomacy program, to the Nicholas Institute for Environmental Policy Solutions, and to the Duke Global Health Institute for co-sponsoring this event. Finally, thanks to the UNEP team for the smooth coordination and kindness, and the DUCIGS super team at the making the Rethinking Diplomacy program possible. For questions, everyone, please use the Q&A function, and we look forward to a very insightful discussion. Welcome, everyone. Dr. Losos, please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chris. I just want to repeat how fortunate we are to have Joyce Msuya joining us today. She is, as I think you all are aware, the Deputy Director of UNEP and also the UN Assistant Secretary General. She is from Tanzania and now, of course, living in Nairobi, and it has a background as a microbiologist. I am not going to go through her lengthy and incredibly impressive resume because much of it was already summarized in the announcement, but just a reminder that she not only has been in the UN since 2018, but before that had more than 2 decades working with the World Bank Group all over the world in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, including living in China and South Korea. And now, of course, with her important work with UNEP in Nairobi. So with that, I just want to hand it over so we can listen to our speaker. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Liz and Chris and Bill as well for inviting me. And I'm really delighted to be at this seminar and to speak to the community of Duke and beyond. So very, very special thanks and warm greetings from Nairobi, Kenya. Let me start my talk now. Enlightenment thinkers sought to separate humans from nature. They saw nature as a machine that could be conquered, tamed, and controlled to meet human needs. It was a narrative of domination, of control, of humankind's superiority over nature. This view of the living world has become embedded in the systems and institutions that govern much of the world we have built. It's a view that has had dire consequences for the living world and our place in it. In the belief that nature is a machine that can be fine-tuned, we have altered Earth systems and crossed planetary boundaries. We've changed the makeup of the atmosphere so dramatically that we have triggered a climate emergency. we have destroyed the richness of life to such a degree that we have triggered a crisis of nature and extinction. And in our hunger to consume more and more, we've produced so much waste that we have triggered a crisis of pollution that has turned our air and water toxic. When we speak of the triple planetary crisis, this is what we mean: the interconnected crisis of climate, nature loss, and pollution that threaten to undermine our ability to survive and thrive on this planet. In our quest for dominion over nature, we have, in the words of the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, declared war on nature. The signs are all around us. Atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases are now higher than at any time in the past 800,000 years. By burning fossil fuels, we are on course for 3 degrees Celsius of global heating by 2100. Climate zones are already shifting. A massive melting of glaciers and ice sheets is underway. Sea level rise and more extreme weather are already driving people from their homes. And we are seeing this all over the world. The richness of life that is so essential for human well-being is rapidly deteriorating. Species of animals and plants are going extinct tens to hundreds of times faster than the natural background rate. And in our drive to satisfy growing demands, humans are using more and more of the Earth's land, fresh water, and oceans for things like food, fiber, energy, and minerals. In the process, we are threatening our own health by releasing vast quantities of pollutants. Fertilizers that wash our rivers and into our seas have produced more than 400 dead zones that total an area the size of Ecuador, and up to 400 million tons of heavy metals, solvents, toxic sludge, and other industrial wastes enter the world's waters every year. If this continues, then we will fail to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. The collapse of the living world, coupled with climate change and pollution, will undermine our efforts on 80% of the SDGs targets. 80%. Progress on reducing poverty and hunger while boosting access to healthcare and water will be impossible. The international community has known this for decades. We have set target after target to protect life and then enshrined these targets in multilateral agreements. But despite some progress, we have failed to meet most of them. In fact, we've exerted so much pressure on the planet that scientists think we may have entered a new geological epoch, the Anthropocene, the age of humans. This means that we have become the dominant force shaping the living world. A success for Enlightenment thinking, but at a terrible, terrible cost. Those of us alive today are the first people to live at a time when the dominant risk to our survival is ourselves. The scale of the challenge before us is daunting. It requires nothing less than a system-wide transformation of the world we have built, a fundamental change in the technological, economic, and social organization of society, a rethinking of worldviews, cultural norms, our values, and the way we govern ourselves, a transformation of our relationship with the living world. This is one of the greatest challenges we have ever faced, but we know that it is not insurmountable. Transformation does not necessarily entail changing everything at all at once. It can come from incremental but cumulative changes that start to alter the the fundamental ways we do things. So what are some of the immediate changes that need to happen? What can we do right now to ensure that humans can flourish within the safe limits of our planet? To address the climate crisis, we need governments to step up. We need more ambitious climate commitments. And then we need the courage, vision, and leadership to enact bold policies that transform energy systems and the way we use land and oceans, how we grow food, and how we build our cities. On nature, we'll need to dramatically expand protected areas, create biological corridors, and provide space for nature to thrive so that we can begin to bring back the richness of life essential for our well-being. On waste and pollution, simply implementing the international conventions that already exist would make a massive difference. But what practical steps can we take that might trigger transformative change? Well, governments must start to measure what really matters. For too long, we've used GDP as the key indicator of social progress. A rise in GDP means we are doing well, but GDP has been rising for decades and we are not doing well. The climate crisis, the nature crisis, pollution, waste, rising inequality, a crisis of democracy. The very bedrock of our existence, the living world, is unraveling around us. GDP fails to account for any of this. So we need a new measurement that values nature. A yardstick like the UN's Inclusive Wealth Index is a much better measure of sustainable economic progress than GDP. It would ensure that investments are redirected to activities that restore nature, reduce pollution, and expand renewable energy. And it would rapidly speed up the shift to the circular economies that reject the take, make, chuck mentality encouraged by our current economic model. Governments must also put a price on carbon and phase out harmful subsidies. This step alone would be enough to trigger a cascade of actions that would lead to a transformative change. The $5 trillion in subsidies to fossil fuels, unsustainable agriculture, fishing, mining, and transportation could be spent instead on boosting new business models, alternative livelihoods, and low-carbon, nature-friendly solutions. COVID is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to enact some of these policies. Governments must allocate far more of their response packages to green infrastructure and retrofitting buildings. They need to spend more on public transport and mobility, clean energy, and nature-based solutions. But we need to be careful. There is a tremendous difference in the ability of governments to enact these measures. High-income countries have a moral obligation to help other nations transform. At the moment, they're failing. Low-interest finance must be made available to low-income countries so that people hit the hardest by the crisis can begin to adapt to the massive planetary shifts that are already underway. At this point, you might be thinking, but what can I do? What role can academic institutions play? The answer is a lot. The scale of the crisis is so great that it throws up questions for almost every single academic discipline. It's political and economic. It's cultural. It's a public health issue. It poses profound spiritual and philosophical questions of ethics and law. Art and literature too, in their power to transform values. And there is obviously the science itself that is always being refined and upgraded, shedding new light on the levers and leverage points of transformation. Academic institutions also have a tremendous role to play in sounding the alarm, raising awareness of the planetary crisis, and educating people about the solutions available to us. Talks, editorials, social media are the megaphones. We must use every tool in the box. Universities also have tremendous power to change cultural values, values that determine how we view our relationship with nature. If we are going to move away from a mindset of exploitation and extraction, domination and control to one of collaboration, regeneration, and balance, then a fundamental shift in our values is critical. In the Anthropocene, in this age of humans, the power to make peace with nature and to reimagine and rebuild our world lies within us. The stakes are huge, but I take tremendous comfort knowing that every single one of you listening today has the power to help transform our relationship with nature in a way that expands human prosperity while easing the extreme pressures on our planet. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for those opening remarks, laying out both the impending and current global threats, as well as some possible solutions. So for all of the attendees, just to make sure you are aware of how we are organizing the Q&A, myself, I'm Dr. William Pan. I'm at the Nicholas School of Environment and Global Health Institute at Duke, and Dr. Elizabeth Losos will be moderating and asking some questions, and then we're going to take some questions from the Q&A. Just to get us started, I wanted to ask you a question about some of the past agreements and calls for action in the UN. And so when I think about some of the history of the UN, going back to the formation, in 1947, for example, there was the first session of the Population Commission talking about the impact population has on the environment. And then you have the 1968 UN General Assembly recognizing the impact of urbanization on environmental degradation. And then, of course, in the call for Making Peace with Nature report, it's noted that the 1972 Stockholm Conference had a new declaration and action plan on human and environment. But then even going forward, when you think about the Rio Conference in 1992, which was kind of the concept of sustainable development, and then the subsequent conference of the Rio +20 in 2012, where we began outlining the sustainable development goals. And I think about those meetings and the calls for action at the global level, and reading this call for stopping the war on nature, engaging policymakers in different ways. How is that different than what we've done in the past? Because I think you've outlined that it is critical right now that we succeed in this. So how is this different? What are we doing differently now with this call for action that we didn't do in the past?
Thank you, Bill, for a very good question. So let me give you a personal example, and then I'll come to answering your question. You know, I started my career back in late 90s as a health professional. And at the time, health was being seen as a pretty much siloed sector outside development, because most of the planning and investments at the national, but also global level, were going into infrastructure, hardcore infrastructure. And because I used to be a scientist and a researcher, I was wondering, despite the mortality rates, for example, on things like HIV, AIDS, and other big infections, how come policymakers were not seeing the cost of inaction? And I still remember some of the shifts started happening in terms of real actions when some of the health challenges were put in the context of bigger development agenda. Now, coming back to your question, and it's a very good one, Bill. Yes, there have been many global meetings and what have you. I would still argue they have been helpful in actually elevating the political will and leadership at the global level, but also formation of coalitions. If you look at UNEP, we were born out of the Stockholm Convention, but also the Rio and the birth of SDGs have actually allowed the environmental issues to be put in the context of bigger development agendas. So one is, what is different is, I would argue, the interconnectedness of the challenges, including environmental. If you're going through a pollution challenge in a specific country, how is it linked to health of the population and the demographics projections and therefore potential revenue for a country? That is one. I think two, I would say technology has connected the both affected population, but also academic institutions. Now, whether you go to a villager in a developing country or a business person in an emerging market, they may not articulate climate change the way some of the environmental experts will do, but they will notice that, oh, the water levels are going down. Yeah. So an average citizen is much more aware of the issues thanks to technology, social media, education, etc., at the aggregate level. Three, I would say advocacy. I mean, look at the youth and the power and the energy that they bring and the pressure they put on politicians. That is new compared to the past. And again, because of technology, they're much more connected than was the case before. And lastly, I would argue the science is there. I mean, most of the issues now, you look at the nature. I talked about the wealth index. It had to be grounded on science. And the global assessments that were summarized in Making Peace with Nature actually have alluded to that. The global environmental outlook, talking about systemic transformations that are required. That's new knowledge that is actually helping to inform policy. So the science policy interface is much stronger, but it will still continue to grow. And I think that's where the role of academic institutions like Duke University, the engagement of students, the interdisciplinary nature of some of your programs are absolutely critical. Over to you.
Let me follow up on that comment. So how do you measure success? What would you expect to see in 10 years, or next year is UNEP's 50th anniversary? What would you expect at the 75th anniversary? And how would you know whether you've actually been successful or not?
I think success is very contextual. If you look at the Paris Agreement, that was a successful moment. But now we're moving into more ambitions, and we're looking at COP26 to see what will actually happen, including some of the financing packages that are being discussed. So I think at the global level is real commitment, but commitment is good. Even better is action. And that's what citizens, young people are pushing, whether it's related to NDCs, when you look at climate change, or even adaptation plans in certain countries. And then you have to go down. You have to go down at the national level, where a lot of these, where the rubber hits the ground, where the policies are formulated, and there the context matters. I'm in Kenya. The context in Kenya is very different from Sri Lanka, because the drivers behind environmental degradation may be very different depending on the context. And that's where the national planning and the metrics and the capacity to monitor progress towards global commitments, such as the Paris Agreement, or now we're waiting for the post-2020 biodiversity framework, could actually be measured. But I think at the global level, and you've heard our Secretary General speaking, Sustainable Development Goals actually provide an umbrella set of aspirations that we should measure ourselves. And right now, by all indicators, we are way, way behind. We did not foresee COVID, and COVID has had an external shock both to the economies, but also to different countries. So we would probably see a bit of a slowdown. But for me, I've always believed you can only manage and lead what you can measure. And at the country level, we're very encouraged to see whether it's through the NDCs or adaptation plans where you do have indicators. I think there is also room to learn from what has not worked very well. Why didn't the Aichi targets, for example, not work? What are the capacities, because different countries have different capacities in implementing some of these global agreements. Over to you.
I really like that comment you made about what gets measured is important. It's a mantra. I always tell my students in my classes that similar to the Millennium Development Goals, the reason why we were successful in those is because we actually had very good ways of measuring them. But there's a question in the chat that reminded me of something that Liz and I were kind of going back and forth about how Western countries have benefited from the use of fossil fuels over the past 50 or 100 years and really became kind of the rich, powerful countries of today. And then when we think about the push for investing in green infrastructure or investing in green and sustainable cities, most of it is still coming from wealthy countries, especially in research and development. So I'm wondering, how does UNEP play a role in both addressing, say, the lower income countries' feelings of that they can't take advantage as much of the fossil fuels and resource extraction industries to become developed, because that has been the model, versus, say, as we transition to a more greener infrastructure society, a lot of these poorer countries cannot invest the way wealthier countries can. So there's an equity gap. So how does UNEP help bridge that equity gap?
Thanks, Bill. It's a very pertinent question that we get all the time. How do we help as UNEP? I think one is making a very strong case grounded on science that environmental problems are everybody's problems, because now a pollution across a geographical border can and does have an impact of where you are. You're absolutely right. If you look at the data, the big GHG emitters are actually developed countries. If you look at our emissions gap report, we have provided science to actually give the data so everybody can see who are the big emitters and what are the possible policy options that countries could take. We also recognize that some of this transitional phase from fossil fuels to renewable energy have a cost. And that's where, for example, meetings at the global level as the upcoming COP in Glasgow can actually help to mobilize resources to try and have a right mix of adaptation and mitigation when you think about transition. I think on the equity side, what we are seeing also, and we are part of our mandate is to share experiences. For example, through our office in India, we have managed to connect some entrepreneur businessmen and women who are working on renewable energies at a very, very low cost for low-income populations. During one of my last trips to India, I actually went to a desert in Kochi to see how women are using solar panel to generate clean energy for cooking and what have you, instead of other options. So part of our mandate is also to connect some of these technologies and businesses, but also experiences from other developing countries on renewable energy and bring them to others. So I mentioned India because as part of our convening role, we brought the experts from India who are focusing on renewable energy for low income with some of the African entrepreneurs who are interested in scaling up that business. The second is showing some of the government-induced policy options that have actually helped to transition. You know, for example, some governments are giving tax relief, including here in Kenya, if you do go with renewable energy. So sharing some of the tools that policymakers can use. But frankly, a lot of what we do is producing science as a normative organization to demonstrate to policymakers the cost of inaction vis-a-vis the cost of action. Bring the voice to different COPs, not just of governments, but private sector, young, indigenous communities, civil society. Recently, I had a meeting here together with the UK presidency with the Kenyan NGOs that are bringing a different voice to the COP26. So those are some of the work through convening, through science, through sharing of experience, through helping to mobilize some resources and partnering with others to try and support the developing countries in this regard. Over to you.
So we are going to bring in some more of the questions from the audience, but one important topic that I'd like to make sure we touch upon, which really builds on this idea of UNEP partnering and depending on research and science. Duke University, of course, as you know, has a large environmental research and education and policy program. Could you give us examples of how you might want to work with researchers or students here at Duke? But also I'd like for you to reflect on this idea of the problem where research doesn't actually get implemented on the ground, and whether you see an opportunity between Duke and UNEP to make sure that the work going on in universities such as Duke and elsewhere in the world really does get translated into real action.
Thank you, Liz. So I would mention two very specific areas. I mean, Duke University has such strong human capital and expertise in mercury, and especially focusing on small mining projects. So I think one area is around mercury. In UNEP, we have a Minamata Convention, which is an independent convention, but administratively is mapped to UNEP. I think they're bringing some of the research, particularly on technology, particularly on some of the work that Duke University has done, for example, in Peru, and bringing the expertise that you have to some of our scientific review mechanisms. That's one concrete area that we can do. I know a number of Minamata COPs have actually benefited from Duke professors, so continuation of that, including on side events where you could actually present your research findings, because most of these COPs bring together policymakers. And that's where the research and policy can come together. Now, you raised the other second area, I would say, is the sustainable infrastructure financing. We have a program through our economy division. We're looking at how do we, as governments, are putting in more money into investments, how can we promote sustainable infrastructure financing. We have the financing initiative under UNEP, where we've set out the principles of sustainable banking, for example, and a number of banks have actually signed up for it. So that's a second area that we can collaborate on. On the point about research and policy, I think some of the policymakers sometimes remind us that research is good, but even better has to be policy oriented, because then you have to think about your research findings and how can they actually speak to a policymaker, to a minister of finance or a technical minister, in a very simple ways. But I think there again, Duke is quite a leader in many ways on environmental research, and where we can also sort of complement each other to see what is relevant. For example, as we are moving into the last decade of action on sustainable development goals, is there some of your research in different areas that we can tap on? And lastly, is through the engagement of students. UNEP is part of the UN system. Almost all your student nationals or countries are represented in the United Nations. So bringing the voice of the students through joining, for example, internship programs or some of our online courses, or pursuing careers in the international community, because that's how different voices are brought to the UN to make the institution even stronger and truly multilateral. Over to you.
So I wanted to move to a couple of questions on the Q&A. The first one is from Elliot Davis. And Elliot is asking, can you speak about the impact of violations of, this is in referring to environmental crimes, and about your comment about enacting new laws for tackling climate, nature, and pollution. So can you speak about the impact of violations of current forest, fishing, and wildlife laws or environmental crimes on the domestic and international levels, and how UNEP is seeking to prevent these?
That's a very loaded question, Elliot. So, I mean, I would say definitely we have, as you may know, a very strong environmental law program. We also, as part of our relationship with different multilateral environment agreement, for example, CITES, when it comes to illegal trading, we work very, very closely. We do condone, and you might have seen many statements that my boss, Inga Anderson, or sometimes Secretary General, has come out and actually spoke against illegal fishing and what have you. We do provide science at the country level because every country is different, yeah? So there is no one size fit all. But we do condone any action activity that actually impacts environmental. I mean, I'll give you an example. Plastic pollution along oceans is a big problem. If you look at some of the economies along that depend on fishing as part of the economy, the plastic pollution, the plastic that ends up in the ocean, it's about 8 million tons per year globally, does affect the fishing industry. So in certain countries, one is we work on advocacy, raising awareness, because some of the population, say the fishing industry communities, may not be aware. So we do run campaigns. One of our biggest campaign is Clean Seas campaign, for example. And then two, we provide as much as we can data, the link between marine litter and the impact on the fishing industry, and link it to health hazards and sometimes economic terms. And that usually tends to happen at the sovereign national level. We do mobilize resources as part of the marine litter, for example, and with beneficiaries from different donors. We bring around resources from donors to help countries address some of the marine litter challenges. And then through our environmental law, because we cannot really go in, we're not a court as such when the laws get broken, but we absolutely come out and condone. And sometimes we do the informal interactions where we engage with the right parties as needed, especially if they've signed up for different types of agreements. So you have to unbundle, but those are some of the examples how we address some of these issues. Over to you, Bill.
So I have another loaded question from our audience. One of the attendees mentioned that unsustainable population growth is contributing to a lot of this trifecta of problems the world is having. How does UNEP deal with this issue?
We do not directly deal with unsustainable population growth as such. There are other UN entities, including UNFPA and others, that are dealing with the population funds. Where we do come is actually providing data to show how city planning, here in Nairobi, where we're headquarters, our neighboring UN agencies, UN Habitat, which deals and works with cities, with settlement. So in certain countries, for example, as mayors are working on city planning and looking at the demographics and the projections, there we come in to talk about how one can plan, or we contribute our expertise, how one can plan sustainable cities. So one of our joint program with UN Habitat is Sustainable Cities Program. That involves a number of mayors. The second is we share experiences, including from countries that did not think about population growth and its impact, for example, on sustainable consumption and production, especially when you think about the projected middle class, as you see in a number of emerging countries. And there we have a program on, and I talked about it, how do we recycle, reuse rather than just use and chuck away. So the sustainable consumption and production agenda. And then lastly is circular economy, thinking about, for example, the agriculture sector. If you look at in a number of developing countries, the agriculture sector is dominant in the economy. So from cradle to grave, how can the agri sector be more sustainable, from the use of input fertilizers to eating more sustainable produce? So that's where we are coming in, but not so much of controlling the population. But also what we are seeing in a number of countries, because of the high cost of living, the demographic dimensions are also changing. When I was born, I mean, it was not uncommon for families to have 6 or more than 6 children. But now my generation, even a younger generation, you have 2 or 3 and you think, if I want good quality of life for my kids, then I also have to think about how many children one produces. But you see the different segmentation in lower income part of the communities. That type of knowledge is still being reinforced by other UN agencies, NGOs, as well as different foundations that are working directly on population growth. Over to you.
I would just add to your answer, just because I'm aware of a lot of NGOs that do different collaborations with UNEP. They take a One Health approach. And an example of one is an NGO called Conservation for Public Health. And it's run by an NC State graduate named Gladys Kalima. And, she's a veterinarian working with gorilla conservation, but the way she engages conservation is through family planning exercises with local communities, as well as ways to more strategically collect firewood, as well as conservation for the environment. It's actually, those types of One Health approaches are excellent for bringing in the population and the environment issues at the same time. So I would just, UNEP definitely is involved in those kind of spaces as well. Just kind of adding on to your answer.
That's the advantage of having somebody who knows us very well. Thank you, Bill. Great.
Okay, so another question from the audience. This is coming from Axel Berkey. He asks, the current economic system often fails to incorporate costs that are passed onto the public and the environment. How do we begin to incorporate these externalities in our economies to better understand the true costs of industrial and behavioral practices?
Sorry, I didn't understand the first part of the question. The current economic models?
Fails to incorporate costs that are passed on to the public and the environment. So I believe he's referring to the use of GDP, for example, that you were discussing during your opening remarks. And how do we begin incorporating the externalities that occur from developing our economic systems to understand the true costs of industrial production and human behavioral practice?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a question. As they say, life is a long-term learning process. I mean, in the 60s, we didn't have the kind of understanding, for example, on the value of nature as we do now. When we came out with this Nature Wealth Index, we worked very closely with the World Bank Group to try, and a number of countries that are well endowed, for example, with forests, to say, let's think about how do you do valuation of nature. Yeah, that's a very new concept for a number of economists. Now that we have an index, I think we have a real opportunity to then look at the GDP plus Nature Wealth Index to say, okay, when we are doing projections and think about our production models, can we take all those factors? So one, I would say, it's not so much we drop one or the other. It's more, how do we leverage new knowledge to actually be better when it comes to protecting the planet? I think two is, I'm glad, Bill, you mentioned about One Health. It's about interconnectedness. If you've read our publication, the Global Environment Outlook 6, which came out, I think it was 2019, in addressing a number of environmental challenges, whether it's energy or food, the science was telling us that we need to think about systemic transformations, because you cannot address climate separately from nature. We know that if you plant trees and have forest zones, it actually helps climate. So thinking about the interconnectedness of the different elements of the economy rather than, and that requires work, because in most governments, bureaucracies are very siloed. So part of our work, for example, what we are trying to do in UNEP, in addition to dealing with ministries of environment in certain countries, is how do we bring trade ministers, how do we bring finance ministers, so they look at some of the environmental challenges and opportunities as long-term contributors to the big economic story of the countries. So it's not an easy question to answer, but I'm very optimistic. I'm optimistic because we are still continuing to learn. We've heard about nature-based solutions, and now most countries, as part of the Sustainable Development Goals, they're actually thinking, how can we use nature as part of the solution of some of the problems that we have? We are trying to link more and more environment and other sectors. One Health, we've seen, for example, the impact and the interconnectedness between pollution and health, and therefore mortality, including amongst children, health cost when it comes to hospital. So talking about the interconnectedness, and that's what this Making Peace with Nature publication is talking about, the interconnectedness of the three planetary crises. Over to you. But Axel, it's not, there's no easy answer to your question, but that's my attempt at cracking at it.
So another one of these questions deals with the result of when we really haven't made peace with nature, and those are climate refugees. And by the time people are willing to give up their homes and flee the country, flee their home countries because of essentially natural disasters and climate change, it is a little late to do some of the things that you're trying to promote. So what do we do then?
I would actually add climate refugees and climate and security. One of our growing programs is actually environment and security, because we are seeing, for example, in the Sahel, because of the climate challenges, sometimes there are security challenges as well. What do? I mean, we do, in the case of some parts of Africa, for example, we've done some diagnostics to just try and find out, are there any other in partnership with other organizations, NGOs included, the World Bank Group, Political Affairs, which is part of the UN, to see are there any other job creation opportunities that could help some of the poor populations to move towards, to try and manage or help inform the management of pressure that exists on say, deserts. Area. The other program, which is run by our sister organization, the Desertification Convention, is looking at the Great Green Wall. And that involves a number of UN entities. We are one involved, but also other governments that are supporting. We're working on water conservation, for example, thinking about how can technologies, very simple, it could be drip irrigation, to help address some of the water shortages that tend to happen in some of the drought areas. But it's a real problem, because in certain areas where naturally you have deserts, there is so much one can do. But where we can come in to try and help is provide some diagnostics, but also work with other UN entities and other development partners to see if job opportunities could be created through different avenues, so as not to put so much pressure, for example, on the agriculture sector, because you don't have a lot of fertile land. But it's a very challenging issue across the world, actually. Over to you, Lizzie.
So we only have about 6 minutes left, and we have a lot of questions on the Q&A, so I don't think we're going to get to all of that. I apologize to the attendees. I did want to ask a question about COVID and the report that UNEP has, and also going back to a comment you had made with the first question about the difference that this report, the approach that this report has and the advantages that this report has in terms of changing behavior. So everyone knows that COVID has really changed the way we do everything, from communication on Zoom to how we communicate with our friends and family. But one of the things that is occurring now, especially as people get vaccinated, and I see this on social media, and maybe this is just a function of my own limitations of people that I know on social media, but the first things that people always want to do when they get vaccinated is to travel, right? And one of the things that I've done with COVID is that I have not flown on an airplane in about 15 months, right? And so my climate carbon impact has been significantly declined. And so I wonder, as people are about to become free or have this conception of being free, how does UNEP change the mindset of this freedom perspective? And I'm not saying people should not be free. They should obviously be free. But before they take their first step onto an airplane and contribute to a carbon footprint, what is UNEP's role in trying to change that first decision-making process and trying to get people to think about nature first in their decision-making process?
Yeah, look, I mean, Bill, I'm glad you have not traveled for 15 months. Some of our jobs, including mine, I mean, pre-COVID, I was spending quite a lot of time in airports and what have you. I think what COVID has managed to do, now this I'm talking about UNEP as an institution, definitely we have invested more in technology. We have been able, in terms of business continuity, we've been able to work. We never shut down UNEP. And what that means in reality at the organization level, and then I'll come to your question, is even after COVID, and some of us are starting to get vaccinated, we will have to rethink, do we need to travel or can I do this meeting? So we'll make different choices. We had just in February, our United Nations Environment Assembly, 100% virtual, yeah? And we actually, interestingly, we had more participants because people could connect, whether they're in Papua New Guinea or South America, and the true multilateralism, with its own limitations, it happened. So what I'm trying to get at is, I believe after COVID, some of our old behavior will be modified or changed. Travel, definitely one. Two, connectivity, some of the meetings. I think in some things, they'll still have to be hybrid. Now, you asked, what do we do? I mean, look, COVID for most part of the world is still a humanitarian issue. It's still a real job losses issue. I mean, we're seeing, even here in Kenya, scientists, experts are saying we're going through a third wave. So we should not lose sight of that. We are not sure yet when it will be over and what the real impact on economies and social would be. What we are sharing publicly is how we have managed to reduce our travel, but also be somewhat effective because of COVID. Would we ban travel 100%? I don't think so, but it definitely will have to prioritize. We have shown that we can connect through Zooms. It's a bit of a fatigue, but for certain meetings, instead of getting on a plane for 2 days, definitely there will be a re-evaluation, at least from the organizational side. But at the end of the day, it's a personal, I mean, we do not dictate what happens in sovereign countries, but I do believe that there will be important lessons from COVID that will help inform future choices, individual, collectively, or organizational. Yeah.
I would just add to that this moment during COVID when we did see a decrease in pollution and when people did find that nature was one of the few places that they could retreat to, that is sort of a moment to support this idea of peace with nature. So hopefully some of those lessons will also be learned. I think we are hitting our 1 hour mark in just a moment. So Bill, I don't know if you have any further questions, but I do want to take this opportunity to thank you for this very enlightening conversation and also congratulate UNEP for a really important report, which if viewers haven't had a chance to look at it, I believe in the chat box, the link is there for anyone to go ahead and download it. Bill, any final words from you?
No, I just want to thank you so much for your time. It's really great that you were able to join us today and have this great conversation. And I really hope that everybody does take a look at the report. So it's a really important thing to read and embrace.
Thank you. So Bill, if I could also thank you and the entire Duke University family for inviting UNEP and me to engage with the students. I think if there is one message, definitely I would support yours. Please read the report. Interconnectedness challenges can only be addressed by collective action. And I think we should all know, no matter where you are, we have the power to actually make a difference and make peace with nature. Our Secretary General has talked about it. The science is very clear. We have more than enough science. I think now it's the time to put even additional pressure on our own personal actions to move forward. But thank you for having me.
Thank you. Chris, any last comment to close?
So no, thank you everyone, and let's continue to be tuned to the next events on the Rethinking Diplomacy program and 75 webinars. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.
Thank you. Bye. Thanks.